Welcome everyone, this is Jennifer Salamu and welcome back to this video lesson.
And today we're going to discuss Chapter 7, Unit 4, Living and Working Conditions in Australia around 1900s. You can check them on your book on pages 290 to 296. And today, at the end of this lesson, you will be able to list the common fatal diseases across the country in 1900 and identify the main features of housing, sanitation, transport, education, and industry that influence living and working conditions in Australia. Now let's have a short review before we start with our new lesson. Okay, let's do this together. Conflict. Okay, it means not peaceful cooperation due to lack of understanding of indigenous life, racial discrimination, and desire for land and material gain. So racial discrimination and frontier conflict. British who colonized Australia believed that British were the most highly developed race on the globe. Theories such as the Great Chain of Being and racial purity, and also Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest, reinforce their attitudes. Historical and biological links to Britain became source of pride to many of them. And frontier conflict between Europeans and Aboriginal people, including battles, acts of resistance, and open massacres, started when pastoral expansion caused conflict over land. Okay, examples of conflicts. Myall Creek Massacre in New South Wales. This involved brutal murder of 28 Aboriginal men, women, and children on the Myall Creek cattle station in New South Wales. Black Wars in Tasmania. Indigenous Tasmanians and settlers fought a guerrilla-style war during which a bounty was paid by the government for captured Aboriginals. And Pinjarra Battle in Western Australia. Governor Stirling revenged on Pinjarra tribe for the earlier attacks on white settlers, and Governor Stirling wanted to affirm his authority and power over the Aboriginals. And conflict at Lagrange Bay. 3 men searching for new pastoral land were speared and clubbed to death. And now let's proceed to our lessons for today. Chapter 7, Unit 4, Living and Working Conditions in Australia around 1900. So, what was it like to live and work in Australia around 1900? Okay, so first, where did people live? In 1900, approximately 52% of Australians live in towns and cities of more than 2,500 people. And the rest, or the remainder, live on farms or pastoral stations. Now, when we say station, it's a large land holding used for producing livestock like cattle or sheep. And also in small rural communities supplying wool, minerals, and others to the colonial and international market. So that means still a lot of people live in agricultural area. But now, at present, nearly 70% of the population lives in large towns and cities. During 1900, there was the constant threat of death and disease across Australia. And the most common fatal diseases were diphtheria, typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and intestinal infections. Now, how about the causes of these diseases? So these diseases were linked to dirty, poor water supplies, inadequate removal of sewage, and limited or not enough understanding of proper hygiene. So let's say, for example, typhoid fever. It was caused by bacterial contamination of food or water. So victims suffered with severe diarrhea, high fever, vomiting, and headaches. And another one, cholera. It was also caused by infected water and led to excessive diarrhea and severe dehydration. Okay, so that's cholera. Next, another disease was diphtheria. This was characterized by bluish skin color, blocked nose, and difficulty breathing. So the disease often led to blocking of the airways, which could lead to suffocation. Next, tuberculosis. It was a very common illness, usually affecting lungs, as you can see here in the picture. It killed around 25% of people in the 19th century, and victims developed a cough and bleeding from the lungs. It was also known as consumption. But today, tuberculosis is curable. Okay, next. Smallpox led to people feeling tired and weak, followed by the appearance of rashes like that, of rash, and the outbreak of large sores on the body. So that's smallpox. And the last one, the bubonic plague was the most common plague. This is when the bacteria travel from a flea bite to lymph nodes. It causes flu-like symptoms and it turns your lymph node into painful, swollen balloons called buboes, which can grow to the size of chicken eggs. Yeah, that's bubonic plague. It's one of the causes of the Black Death in the Middle Ages. And the disease traveled along trade routes reaching India in 1896 and in Australia in 1900. And thankfully, these diseases had been eradicated in Australia due to medical research, vaccination, and public health programs. Now let's move on. Let's have some deadly facts about living in Australia in 1900. So let's have the average life expectancy. When we say average life expectancy, that's the average period that a person may expect to live. So for men, that was 55 years old, and for women, 59 years old. Now, what about the major causes of death between the ages of 15 and 44? So for men, that's tuberculosis, and for women, tuberculosis and childbirth. So for every 1,000 live births, approximately 72 women died in childbirth. And for infant mortality rate, that's more than 10%. So that means in 1,000 live births, more than 100 infants died. So two capital cities, Melbourne, capital city of Victoria, and Perth, capital city of Western Australia, provide an insight into some features of living conditions in Australia at the turn of the century. However, the population size and economic development of these cities were different. Well, Melbourne had large population and progressive economy compared to Perth. And now, let's take a look at health and sanitation in Melbourne and Perth. So when we say sanitation, it's the process of keeping places from dirt, infection, disease, and others by removing waste, trash, and garbage, or by cleaning the streets. So in 1880s, Yarra River running through Melbourne had been described as an open sewer. And Melbourne earned the nickname Smellbourne because of the stench or the bad smell from the open sewers and drains. And there's another source, source 40, as you can see here. It's the dirt and filth around an outside toilet. That's photographed in 1901. So here we can say that health and sanitation was not really good during that time. Okay, how about in Perth? So here, Perth's rapid population growth and establishment of factories in the 1890s created pollution of waterways in the city. and 2 large open drains. So when we say drains, that's a channel or a pipe carrying off surplus liquid or water, especially rainwater or liquid waste. So 2 large open drains from the center of Perth flowed into Clay's Brook Drain in East Perth, but by 1890s, it was extremely smelly and polluted. As you can see, based in our source 4C. In East Perth alone, the drain received rubbish from a tannery and other factories, and by the turn of the century, the drain was regarded as disgrace to the council, and local children were warned not to go near it. So here we can really say that water pollution was really a big problem. And because of lack of available land and housing, wealthy people in both Perth and Melbourne moved out of the city center to live in detached houses on their own block of land. And terraced houses were also built in East Perth during the 1890s to meet the growing population's need for cheap housing. When we say terraced houses, so these are row of identical houses with shared walls, just like what you can see in this picture. Okay, so next, disease. Bubonic plague reached Melbourne in 1900, and it was a part of international outbreak of the disease. So, in Melbourne, there were about 1,215 cases and 467 deaths, and 27 recorded deaths in Perth. Another one was typhoid between 1894 to 1898. So this broke out several times during the height of the population boom or increase in Perth. And in 1897, there were 1,408 cases of typhoid recorded in Perth. And from then on, many people called for better drain, proper removal of city waste. Okay, now how about transportation? What's the common transportation in Australia during 1900s, most especially in Perth and Melbourne? So as you can see on the picture, we have here, that's the tramways, and this one, that's bicycle, and on this picture, you can see horse transport, right? Okay, so those were the common transportation during that time. And horse transport was very common. Horse-drawn wagons, carts, and private carriages added to the street traffic, and horse manure added to the range of street smells. Okay, and in 1890s, that's the use of safety bicycles with air-filled tires became very popular also. And also motor-driven omnibuses and the electric trams. And from 1899, the electric tram lines extended into many suburbs of Melbourne and Perth. So here, poor families live in inner suburbs of both cities and they walk to work. Okay, now let's move on. Okay, this time to electricity. So in 1894, Melbourne streets had been electrified. Okay, you already have this electricity. But in Perth, main streets were gas lit, and electrification was only completed in 1912. That was actually late. Okay, now let's move on. Physical growth of Perth. If you can still remember, during our previous lessons, we already discussed why population grew or increased in Western Australia. It's mainly because of gold rushes or gold rush, and the other reason was Victoria suffered an economic downturn during that time, and it led people to migrate to the west. Now, gold rushes enabled Perth and Fremantle to be rebuilt during the 1890s. And during this time, number of buildings doubled and many public buildings emerged. And the population boom of the 1890s led to the emergence of new land subdivisions stretching to the north, east, west of the city center. Okay, now as you can see in our source, from 1884, there were only 6,000 people in Perth. But look at 1901. So from 6,000 to 44,000, and in 1911, the population doubled to 87,000. So that's the population boom in Perth. Now let's have religion. So what was the most popular religion in the 1900s in Australia? So as you can see, that's Church of England, also called Anglican. So that's 40% of the population. And followed by other Christian religion, now called Uniting Church or a Baptist or a Church of Christ. And only 1% followed non-Christian religion. Now let's move on to the education. So by early 19th century, most of the education was provided or run by religious communities or missionaries. However, by 1900, government-funded non-religious primary schools had been established in all the colonies. And the Victorian Education Act of 1972 established free, non-religious, and compulsory government-funded schools for children between the ages of 6 and 13. So that's the primary school. It's like public school for primary students. Next, by 1900, Education Act of 1871 in Western Australia, this time provided government funding to both state and religious schools. However, during that time, compulsory education was not yet enforced because there were still many children who were still working to help their family. And secondary education was not as well resourced in 1900. Now, how about the Aboriginal children? So, from early years of colonization, Aboriginal children were educated to be civilized, that is, to learn European culture and religion. And in 1870s, they were allowed to study in government school. However, European parents complained about the presence of these Aboriginal children. So, from the end of 1800s and 1900s, Aboriginal children in Western Australia were educated in separate schools or on church missions. Okay, now how about the leisure activities for Australians? Now, leisure activities in Melbourne and Perth reflected class structure. So just like, for example, there were sports only wealthy people played, just like tennis, croquet, golf, and polo. So croquet is a gentle lawn sport where balls are tapped through hoops, just like you can see here. Okay, next. There were also popular activities among all social groups. So these were horse racing, cricket, and theater. And also in 1890s, cycling clubs were established in Perth and Fremantle, and football became popular also. And what was the favorite summer sport in both cities? That's cricket. And the main form of indoor entertainment for many Australians were family gatherings around a piano, as well as cards and parlor games. How about you? What do you do for fun? So we're done with our discussion, and now let's have our first activity. Okay, for this activity, I want you to match the words to the correct descriptions. Okay, you have 1 minute to do this, and time starts now. Okay, now let's check your answers. For number 1, it was caused by bacterial contamination of food or water. Okay, that's typhoid. And number 2, it was characterized by bluish skin color, black nose, and difficulty breathing. That's diphtheria. Okay, number 3, it was also caused by infected water and led to excessive diarrhea and severe dehydration. Okay, that's cholera. Next, number 4, it was a very common illness, usually affecting the lungs. Okay, that's tuberculosis. And number 5, it led to people feeling tired and weak, followed by the appearance of a rash and the outbreak of large sores on the body. That's what we call smallpox. Okay, next, it was one of the causes of Black Death in the Middle Ages. Okay, that's bubonic plague. And it's a row of identical houses with shared walls. That's a terrace house. And lastly, it's a gentle lawn sport where balls are tapped through hoops. That's what we call croquet. Well done! Okay, now let's move on to our second activity. There are 3 questions and you have 15 seconds to answer this. And time starts now. Okay, now let's check your answers. For number 1, in 1900, what percentage of the Australian population live in cities larger than 2,500 people? And the answer is letter C. That's 52%. Great. Number 2, what were the major causes of death for Australian women between the ages of 15 to 44 in 1900? The answer is letter A, childbirth and tuberculosis. Number 3, why did wealthy people move out of the city centers of Perth and Melbourne? And the correct answer is letter B, because of lack of available land and housing. Good job! Next, for numbers 4 to 6, you have another 15 seconds. And 15 seconds starts now. Okay, now let's check your answers. So which one was not an impact of the physical growth of Perth? And the correct answer is letter A, the stop of or the end of bubonic plague. Okay, next, number 5. What types of transport did people use during the 1800s and 1900s? And the correct answer is letter B, horses, bicycles, and trams. And number 6, what was the most popular religion in the 1900s in Australia? And the correct answer is letter A. Well done. Now let's move on. Okay, for the last 2, you have another 15 seconds. Now let's check your answers. What did the Victorian Education Act of 1872 establish? And the correct answer is letter C. Okay, free government-funded schools. Okay, next. Number 8. What sport did only wealthy people play in Melbourne and Perth? And the correct answer is that's letter D, tennis, croquet, golf, and polo. Good job! And for our summary, please go through our summary slide. So that's the end of our lesson today. Good job. Okay, for the self-assessment section, I want you to tick the box which you think you can do and cross it out if you still have questions and try to review the lesson again.
Bye everyone! Thank you for watching, keep safe, and see you next time!